The rings were exchanged with trembling hands, both of us shaking, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of what we had just walked through to reach this moment. I slid the band onto Sophia's finger, and my thumb lingered there for a second longer than necessary, pressing the cool metal against her skin, as if sealing a promise that went far beyond the one spoken aloud. She did the same for me. And when our eyes met over our joined hands, something passed between us that no one else in the room could translate, but everyone could feel. On the morning of our wedding in a church packed with over 200 guests, the bride's uncle stood up in the middle of the ceremony and announced that she was destroying her future by marrying a broke black single father who drove trucks for a living. He didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for every person in that building to hear, as if he were saving her from the worst mistake of her life. The entire church went silent. I didn't argue. I just stood there calm, steady, unmoved. But what the uncle didn't know was that his own ignorance was about to turn around and answer him in a way he would never forget. I had never been the kind of man who looked comfortable in a suit. My hands were built for work, thick fingers, rough palms, the kind of hands that had gripped steering wheels for thousands of miles across state lines. I was in my mid-30s, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, with a quietness about me that most people mistook for having nothing to say. The truth was simpler than that. I had plenty to say. I just believed that words without weight were noise, and I had spent most of my life refusing to be noise. In the mirror, I adjusted my collar and glanced down at my daughter. Lily was 5 years old, spinning in circles in her little flower girl dress, watching the fabric fan out around her ankles. She laughed every time it floated up, and every time she laughed, something in my chest loosened just a little. I knelt down and held her still by the shoulders. "You remember what you're supposed to do out there?" Lily nodded very seriously. "Walk slow. Hold the basket. Don't eat the flowers." I smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't come often, but when it did, it changed my whole face and softened everything, erasing the weight I usually carried. I kissed her forehead and stood back up, catching my own reflection again. The ceremony was about to start. Through the walls, I could hear the muffled sound of the organ warming up and the low hum of guests finding their seats. Somewhere out there, over 200 people were waiting to watch me get married, most of them strangers, many of them skeptics, a few of them openly hostile to the idea of their golden girl marrying a man like me. I had known what I was walking into. I had chosen to walk into it anyway. For a moment, my mind drifted. Not to Sophia, not to the ceremony, but to someone else. My late wife, Claire. She had died a few years earlier in a car accident on a rain-slick highway outside of Nashville, sudden and final. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. Claire had believed in me when belief cost nothing, back when I really was just a driver hauling freight for someone else's company, back when the apartment was small and the bills were large and the future looked like more of the same. She never asked me to be anything other than what I was. After Claire, there had been one other woman. Her name was Megan. She had come into my life at a time when things had already started to change, when the company I had quietly built from nothing was beginning to grow in ways that attracted attention. Megan didn't know about any of it at first. She liked me, or at least she seemed to. But the moment she found out what I was worth, something shifted. The way she looked at me changed. The questions changed. She stopped asking how Lily was doing and started asking about properties, investments, vacations. She didn't love me. She loved what she thought I could give her. That relationship ended the way a fire ends when you cut off the oxygen, quickly and with nothing left. And from the ashes of it, I made a decision that would shape everything that came after. Whoever loved me next would have to love the version of me that had nothing. Not the founder, not the owner, just the man, just the father. That was how I met Sophia Bennett, and that was why even now, standing in this church on the morning of our wedding, she still believed I was a truck driver. Sophia was already inside the chapel, hidden behind a set of heavy wooden doors, waiting for the music to begin. She was 29, sharp-eyed, educated, the kind of woman who could read a room the way some people read a book, catching every subtext. Her father, Michael Bennett, was a practicing attorney. Her mother, Patricia, had spent 20 years teaching literature at the state university. Sophia had grown up in a house where opinions were loud, expectations were high, and love, though real, always came wrapped in conditions. She had met me over a year ago at a grocery store of all places, not at a gala, not through friends, not on an app, at a grocery store. I was standing in the cereal aisle holding Lily on one hip, humming a song to keep her calm while she tugged at my collar. Sophia had stopped walking and just watched us. This tall, quiet man with scarred hands and a gentle voice, holding his daughter like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Something in that image reached a part of her she didn't know was waiting. We talked that day and the next week and the week after that. I never told her what I did for a living in any grand way. I said I worked in transportation. She assumed I meant I was a driver. I never corrected her and she never pressed because for Sophia it didn't matter. What mattered was the way I showed up on time every time, the way I listened like the words she said were worth remembering, the way I treated Lily not as an obligation but as my greatest purpose. But the road to this church had not been smooth. The first time Sophia brought me home to meet her family, her mother had smiled politely and said almost nothing. Her father had shaken my hand, looked me up and down, and then disappeared into his study for the rest of the evening. It was Thomas, her mother's older brother, who said what everyone else was thinking. Thomas Bennett was a man who had built a real estate empire from the ground up. He wore his success the way some men wore cologne, heavily and everywhere he went. He was the patriarch of the extended family, the one whose opinion carried the weight of money behind it, and he had never been shy about using that weight. Over dinner that first night, Thomas had leaned back in his chair, looked at me across the table and asked, "So what exactly do you do?" I had answered simply, "I work in logistics, transportation." Thomas had nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already made up his mind. "Logistics?" he repeated, letting the word hang in the air like something slightly beneath him. From that night forward, Thomas had made his position clear, not always with words, but with the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. He never raised his voice to Sophia about me. He didn't have to. He simply made sure she knew through 100 small comments over many months that he believed she was settling, that she was throwing away everything her family had built for her, that a man who drives trucks and raises a child alone could not possibly give her the life she deserved. And the hardest part, the part Sophia never told me, was that there were nights when the pressure almost broke her. Not because she doubted me. She never doubted me. But because the guilt of defying her family sat on her chest like a stone, heaviest in the dark hours when she was alone. Her mother had cried on the phone more than once. Her father had gone quiet in a way that hurt worse than shouting, and Thomas kept reminding her with the precision of a man accustomed to closing deals that love alone had never paid a mortgage. But Sophia held on. She held on because she remembered the cereal aisle. She held on because every time she watched me with Lily, she saw the kind of man that no amount of money could manufacture. She held on because when she looked into my eyes, she didn't see a driver. She saw someone who had survived things he never talked about and came out the other side still gentle. Now, inside the church, the ceremony had begun. The chapel was old and beautiful. High ceilings, stained glass throwing patterns of color across the wooden pews, white flowers lining the center aisle. Over 200 guests filled the rows, split unevenly between the two sides. Sophia's family took up most of the left, uncles, aunts, cousins, colleagues of her parents, all dressed in their best, all whispering. My side was thinner, a handful of close friends, a few people in well-cut suits who nobody paid much attention to, and in the front row, my grandmother, Evelyn, sat with Lily on her lap, her weathered hands holding the little girl steady. When Sophia walked through the doors, the music swelled and every head turned. She was stunning, not in the way of magazine covers, but in the way of a woman who knew exactly what she was walking toward. Her dress was simple, elegant. Her eyes were locked on me at the end of the aisle, but as she walked, she caught sight of her mother in the second row. Patricia was not smiling. Her eyes were red, and she turned her face away, pressing a tissue to her mouth. Those were not tears of joy. Sophia felt the sting of it deep in her ribs, but she kept walking. She reached me. I looked at her the way I always did, steady, present, as if the rest of the room didn't exist. She took my hands. They were warm. The minister, Reverend Samuel Hayes, began the ceremony with the traditional readings. The words floated over the congregation like something practiced and familiar. For a few minutes, the tension in the room seemed to settle. People relaxed into their seats. The whispers quieted. Then Thomas stood up. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for an appropriate moment. He simply rose from his seat in the third row, buttoned his jacket, and stepped into the center aisle with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in a room he was paying for. "I need to say something," Thomas announced, his voice deep, controlled, filling the chapel like a verdict. Reverend Hayes looked startled, but before he could respond, Thomas was already speaking. "I love my niece," Thomas began, looking directly at Sophia. "Everything I've done, every objection, every conversation has been because I love her. I watched my own sister struggle in the early years of her marriage before things got better. I know what financial hardship does to love. I've seen it. And I won't stand here and watch history repeat itself." He turned to me. His eyes were not cruel, but they were hard. The eyes of a man delivering a business judgment. "Marriage is not just about love," Thomas continued. "It's about security. It's about what you can provide. So I'm asking you right here in front of everyone, what can a single father who drives a truck offer my niece? Tell us. Tell all of us." The church went cold. 200 people held their breath. A few of Sophia's relatives shifted in their seats, some nodding slightly. Michael Bennett, Sophia's father, sat rigid, his face unreadable. He didn't support Thomas, but he didn't stop him either. His silence was its own kind of wound. I heard every word. My left hand tightened at my side. A small, involuntary movement that no one saw except my grandmother, who recognized it immediately. Inside, old voices stirred. The voice of a landlord who once told me I didn't look like I could afford the deposit. The voice of Megan telling me I wasn't the kind of man she needed. The voice of every person who had ever looked at my skin, my job, my circumstances, and decided they already knew my story. I swallowed, I breathed, and I chose to stand still. In the front row, Lily watched me from her grandmother's lap. She didn't understand what the loud man was saying, but she could feel something was wrong. Her small fingers gripped Evelyn's sleeve, and the old woman pulled her closer, pressing her lips together. Evelyn knew the truth, all of it, but she also knew her grandson, and she respected the choice I had made long before this day. I looked at Sophia. My eyes didn't plead. They didn't burn with anger. They simply offered her something rare and terrifying, the freedom to choose. My gaze said what my mouth didn't. "I won't make you stay, but I'm not going anywhere." Sophia stared back at me, and in that single breath, her whole life split into two roads. One led back to safety, to her family's approval, to the life they had mapped out for her, comfortable and predictable, but without me. The other led forward into uncertainty, into a future built on nothing but trust in this man standing in front of her. She thought of the cereal aisle. She thought of Lily falling asleep in my arms. She thought of every quiet evening on my porch when I said little and meant everything. Her voice came out thin, but it did not shake. "I choose him," Sophia said, turning briefly toward her uncle. "I have always chosen him." Thomas's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, Reverend Hayes stepped forward, visibly shaken, but doing his best to restore order. He cleared his throat and spoke the words that were supposed to be ceremonial, a tradition, a formality, something no one ever actually answered. "If anyone here has reason to object to this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace." The question dropped into the silence like a match into dry grass, and Thomas, who had never in his life held his peace about anything, was not about to start now. "I object." Thomas's voice hit the quiet like a hammer on glass. He was still standing in the center aisle, shoulders squared, chin lifted, a man accustomed to owning every room he walked into. He looked directly at Reverend Hayes, as though the minister were merely a clerk awaiting instruction. "I object to this marriage," Thomas repeated, louder now, making sure every seat in the chapel heard him clearly. "And I have every right to. That girl up there is my family, my blood. I held her when she was 2 days old, and I am not going to stand by and watch her chain herself to a future that can't support her." A murmur rippled through the pews. Several of Sophia's relatives nodded, not boldly but enough. A few of my friends stiffened. Evelyn pulled Lily tighter into her lap and pressed her hand over the child's ear, though the girl was already looking around with wide, confused eyes. Thomas turned to face me directly. The two of us stood less than 20 feet apart, one in the aisle, one at the altar, and the distance between us felt like a courtroom. "I asked you a question earlier," Thomas said, his voice dropping into something low and deliberate, "and you gave me nothing. So I'll ask again, and this time I want an answer that means something. What can you provide for my niece? Not promises, not feelings. Show me something real, a plan, a number, anything." I met his gaze without flinching. My left hand was still tight at my side, the knuckles pressing hard against my thigh, but my face remained composed, the same stillness that people had always mistaken for emptiness. "I have always fulfilled every responsibility given to me," I said. My voice was calm, unhurried, as though I were stating something so obvious it barely needed saying. Thomas let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, but close enough. "Responsibility," he said, repeating the word the way he might repeat a losing bid. "You drive a truck for a living, you're raising a child on your own, and you want to stand there and talk to me about responsibility?" He shook his head and looked around the church as if inviting everyone to share in what he saw as an obvious conclusion. A few eyes looked down, others looked away. Patricia pressed the tissue harder against her mouth. Michael Bennett remained motionless in his seat, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, present in body, absent in every other way that mattered. His silence was not neutrality, it was surrender, and Sophia could feel it from where she stood. The weight of the room pressed down on her. She could see it clearly. Half the church believed her uncle was right, not because they were cruel, but because they had been taught to measure a man by what he earned. And by that measurement, I was not enough. I took one step forward, not toward Thomas, but toward Sophia. I looked at her, and when I spoke, my voice carried no anger, no defense, only clarity. "I didn't come here to prove anything to him," I said. "I came here for you." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, something shifted in the room, something no one expected. From the back of the church on my side, a man stood up. He was tall, early 40s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had been tailored that morning. He didn't speak. He simply rose from his seat and stood there, hands clasped in front of him, looking straight ahead. A woman, 2 rows in front of him, stood up next, then a man beside her, then another 3 rows back. One by one, like a wave building from the far shore, people on my side began rising to their feet. 5, then 10, then 15. Men and women in sharp suits standing in silence, their faces calm and deliberate. Every conversation in the chapel died at once. For a long moment, no one said a word. 200 guests stared at 15 people standing on the groom's side, and not one of them understood what was happening. Then the first man, the one in the charcoal suit, stepped out of his row and walked slowly down the aisle toward the front. His shoes clicked against the stone floor, each step measured and unhurried. He stopped a few feet from Thomas and turned to address the room. "My name is Alex Harrington," he said, his voice even and professional. "I serve as Regional Director of Operations for the Northeast Division. I manage 4 distribution hubs and over 600 employees." He looked at Thomas, then at the rest of the church. "I report directly to Ryan Thompson. He is my boss." The air in the chapel changed, not gradually, but all at once, like a window shattering. Before anyone could react, the woman who had stood up second stepped into the aisle. She was in her late 30s, poised, wearing a navy blue blazer. "My name is Jessica Reynolds," she said. "I oversee the Atlanta Distribution Center, 200 employees, round-the-clock operations. Ryan gave me my first opportunity in this industry when no one else would. He is the founder and majority shareholder of our company." A third man followed. He was younger, early 30s, built like someone who had spent years doing physical work before moving behind a desk. "My name is Chris Donovan," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made the room lean in. "I started as a driver just like him. Ryan built a program that promoted from within. I now run 3 regional branches across the West Coast." He looked at me with an expression that went beyond professional respect. Everything I have I owe to the chance he gave me. The silence that followed was not the stunned, breathless kind that had gripped the room before. It was heavier, the silence of a congregation realizing all at once that it had been wrong about everything. I was not an employee, and I was not a truck driver struggling to make ends meet. I was the founder and principal shareholder of a multinational logistics corporation, a company I had built from the ground up, starting behind the wheel of a freight truck more than a decade ago, growing it into an operation that now employed thousands of people across multiple countries. And I had never told anyone, not Thomas, not Patricia, not Michael, not even Sophia. The transformation in the room was immediate and total. Faces that had been nodding along with Thomas moments ago now wore expressions of open disbelief. 2 women in Sophia's section covered their mouths with their hands. A man in the 4th row shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the kind of stunned recognition that comes when you realize you have been looking at something the wrong way for a very long time. Thomas stood frozen in the center aisle. His mouth was slightly open, his hands hanging at his sides, all the authority drained from his posture like water from a cracked vessel. The people who had nodded along with him moments ago were now looking at their shoes. Michael Bennett's rigid expression had cracked into something unreadable, his shoulders dropping slowly, as if a wire holding him upright had been cut. Patricia lowered the tissue from her face and stared at me through wet, bewildered eyes. And Lily, 5 years old, sitting in her grandmother's lap, too young to understand wealth or status or corporate hierarchies, simply saw a group of people standing up for her father. She smiled and whispered to Evelyn, "Daddy's friends like him." Evelyn held her close and said nothing, but her eyes fixed on me were shining. Sophia turned to me. She didn't look angry. She looked wounded. The quiet, aching kind of hurt that comes not from betrayal, but from realizing that the person you trusted most had been carrying something enormous in silence, and you never knew. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the hush of that church, every person heard it. I looked at her. For the first time since the ceremony began, something in my composure shifted. The steadiness was still there, but beneath it, visible now like a current under ice, there was vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "I didn't hide it from you," I said quietly. "Everything I have has always been yours. But I needed to know that you chose me, not what I built, not the company, not the money, me." Sophia's eyes filled. "I chose you when I thought you had nothing, Ryan? Wasn't that enough?" I swallowed hard, my jaw tightened, and when I spoke again, my voice was lower, not weaker, but heavier, carrying something that had been locked away for a long time. "You were enough," I said. "You were always enough, but I've been loved before for the wrong reasons. And when that love disappeared, it didn't just leave. It took something with it, something I'm still trying to get back." I looked at her and my eyes held nothing but honesty. "I was afraid, Sophia, not of you, of losing you the way I lost before." She stared at me, and in that moment she saw what had been hidden beneath the calm all along. Not arrogance, not secrecy, but a wound. A scar left by someone who had taught me that love and money could not exist in the same room without one poisoning the other. I had built a wall not to keep her out, but to make sure that what came in was real. Sophia didn't say she forgave me, not yet. Forgiveness was too simple a word for what was happening between us. What she felt was something closer to understanding, the deep, painful kind that comes from seeing another person's fear and recognizing it as your own. She reached out and took my hand. That was all. No speech, no declaration, just her fingers closing around mine, steady and sure. The chapel remained still, but the nature of the quiet had changed. It was no longer the weight of judgment pressing down on the room. It was something closer to reverence, the hush of people watching something private and sacred unfold in front of them, something most of them did not deserve to witness, but could not look away from. Thomas Bennett stood alone in the aisle. The empire of certainty he had built over the course of this confrontation had collapsed around him in less than 3 minutes. He was not a stupid man. He understood perhaps better than anyone in that room what had just happened. He had measured me by the most visible, most shallow metric available, and he had been spectacularly, publicly wrong. But what cut deeper than being wrong was what it revealed about him. He had looked at a black man raising a child alone, heard the word driver, and decided he knew the entire story. He had never once considered that the story might have chapters he hadn't read. And now, standing in that aisle with 15 executives on their feet and his niece holding the hand of a man who could likely buy his entire real estate portfolio without a second thought, Thomas was forced to confront a truth far more uncomfortable than my net worth. He had not been protecting Sophia, he had been protecting his own assumptions. The question now, the one that hung over the entire church like a held breath, was what I would do next. I had the power to humiliate Thomas. I had the evidence, the witnesses, the moral high ground. One word, one gesture, and I could turn this church into a stage for public reckoning. I looked at Thomas. Then I looked at Lily, still sitting in Evelyn's lap, watching me with those wide, trusting eyes. And somewhere in the space between those two faces, I heard a voice. Not Thomas's, not Sophia's, but Claire's. My late wife, speaking from a memory so old it had become part of me. Real strength is when you can hit back and choose not to. My fist unclenched, my shoulders dropped, and the choice was made. I turned to Thomas, not with the sharpness of a man about to strike, but with the measured calm of someone who had already decided what kind of person he was going to be in this moment, and every moment after it. "You were right about one thing," I said, and the words landed gently across the church. "Marriage does require security, but security isn't a bank statement. It's not a portfolio or a property deed." I held Thomas's gaze without malice, without triumph. Security is knowing that the man standing next to your niece just let himself be called a broke nobody in front of every person he's ever cared about and didn't flinch. Not because he couldn't respond, but because the only thing that matters to him in this room is her. Thomas said nothing. His lips pressed together and something behind his eyes shifted. Not an apology, not yet, but the first crack in the wall of certainty he had built around himself. I looked toward the front row where Lily sat, watching me from Evelyn's lap. The little girl raised her hand and waved a small, simple gesture that had nothing to do with money or power or any of the things the adults in this room had been fighting about. I smiled at her, and the smile reached my eyes in a way that nothing else that morning had managed. "I was a driver," I said, turning back to face the congregation. "I hauled freight across 12 states in a truck that broke down more times than I can count. I'm proud of every mile, and before I'm anything else, before any title, before any company, I'm a father. That has always been the most important thing I am." The room held still. No one moved. The 15 people who had stood on my behalf remained standing, but they were no longer the center of attention. I was, and what I had just done, refusing the easy victory, choosing dignity over dominance, spoke louder than any revelation about my wealth ever could. I turned to Sophia. Her hand was still in mine from where she had reached for me moments earlier. I looked down at our intertwined fingers, then back up at her face. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying anymore. She was watching me with an expression I had never quite seen before. Not the admiration of a woman learning her fiancé was wealthy, but something far deeper. It was the look of someone seeing for the first time the full shape of the man she loved, including the parts he had kept hidden, including the fear, including the scars. "I'm sorry I didn't share everything with you," I said quietly. "I should have trusted what we had enough to let you see all of it. I won't hold anything back again." My thumb moved gently across her knuckles. "But I need you to know I wanted you to choose me today the same way you chose me the first time. Just me. Nothing else." Sophia looked at me, and her voice came out clear and unwavering, carrying across the chapel with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "You are what I chose," she said. "Not a title, not a company. You, the man in the cereal aisle with his daughter on his hip, that's who I fell in love with. And that is who I'm marrying today." Something in the room released. It was as though 200 people had been holding the same weight, and all of them set it down at once. What followed was not applause, not movement, just a collective exhale, the kind that only happens in the presence of something true. From the second row, a movement caught Sophia's eye. Her father, Michael Bennett, was rising from his seat. He stood slowly, deliberately, with the careful posture of a man choosing each action with precision. He did not speak. He stepped into the aisle, walked to the front of the church, and stopped directly in front of me. The two of us looked at each other. Michael's face, which had been locked and unreadable throughout the entire confrontation, had softened into something raw, regret perhaps, or recognition, or some mixture of the two that didn't have a clean name. He extended his hand. I took it. Michael nodded once, just once, a single firm dip of the chin that carried the weight of every silent dinner, every avoided conversation, every month of quiet disapproval that he would now have to live with. It was not eloquent. It was not dramatic, but for Sophia, who had been waiting for that one gesture longer than anyone in the room, it was everything. Patricia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at me, truly looked at me perhaps for the first time since the evening I had sat at her dinner table, and answered Thomas's questions with a simplicity she had mistaken for leak. The worry that had clouded her face for months was gone, replaced by something fragile and new. Thomas did not come forward. He remained where he stood in the aisle for another long moment, then turned and walked back to his seat. He sat down without a word, his eyes cast toward the floor. He had not apologized. He had not conceded out loud. But the way he lowered himself into that pew quietly, with none of the authority he had carried when he rose from it, said more than any speech could. In the front row, Evelyn leaned down and whispered into Lily's ear so softly that only the child could hear. "Your grandmother is so proud of your daddy." Lily beamed and kicked her little legs against the pew. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat gently and looked at Sophia and me. "Shall we continue?" he asked, and there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. I nodded. Sophia nodded, and the ceremony resumed. The rings were exchanged with trembling hands, both of us shaking, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of what we had just walked through to reach this moment. I slid the band onto Sophia's finger, and my thumb lingered there for a second longer than necessary, pressing the cool metal against her skin, as if sealing a promise that went far beyond the one spoken aloud. She did the same for me. Same. And when our eyes met over our joined hands, something passed between us that no one else in the room could translate, but everyone could feel. When Reverend Hayes pronounced us married, the church erupted, not in polite applause, but in something fuller, something raw and unscripted that came from a place deeper than etiquette. People who had been sitting in judgment 30 minutes earlier were now on their feet, clapping with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. The 15 executives sat down, but the balance of the room had shifted permanently. The people who had whispered before the ceremony would carry this story with them for the rest of their lives, not as gossip, but as something closer to a lesson they hadn't known they needed. After the ceremony, as guests filed out through the heavy wooden doors into the afternoon light, Lily broke free from Evelyn's hand and sprinted down the aisle toward me. I scooped her up with one arm, and she wrapped herself around my neck. Sophia stepped close and rested her hand on Lily's back, and for a moment, the three of us stood together at the altar. Not a CEO and his bride, not a story about wealth revealed, but a family, simple, whole, and real. Outside the church, Thomas stood alone near the stone steps, watching the guests stream past him. He did not join any conversation. He did not reach for his phone. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the afternoon sun catch the stained glass from the outside, casting faint colors across the pavement. Every few seconds, someone walked past him and looked away. The kind of look people give when they don't know what to say to a man who just lost an argument with his own certainty. Thomas felt every one of those glances, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had no words to fill the space they left behind. When I walked out carrying Lily Sophia beside me, Thomas straightened. As we passed, he spoke quietly, just loud enough for me to hear above the noise of the crowd. "Take care of my niece." I stopped. I looked at Thomas, not with resentment, not with satisfaction, but with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who understood that some bridges take years to build and only seconds to burn, and that the first plank had just been laid. "I will," I said. I shifted Lily to my other arm and kept walking. Prejudice can be loud, success can be silent, but character, the kind that can't be bought, can't be faked, and can't be measured by anything the world puts on a balance sheet, is what makes an entire room stand up. And sometimes love isn't about knowing everything about the person beside you. Sometimes it's about choosing them when you believe there was nothing left to know. As I stood there in that old church with my daughter Lily wrapped tight in my arms and Sophia's hand steady in mine, the weight of everything we'd just walked through settled deep in my chest, and it hit me harder than any headline or any big reveal ever could. In a world that's always screaming at us to size people up by their job titles, their bank balances, or the shine on their shoes, this moment taught me the one truth that still brings tears to my eyes every single time I think about it. Real character doesn't need a microphone or a spotlight to roar. It whispers, it endures, and it stands tall even when the whole room is waiting for you to break. I had let everyone see me as nothing more than a truck driver, a single dad just getting by, because I needed to know, with every beat of my scarred heart, that Sophia loved the man in the cereal aisle, the one with rough hands and a quiet love that didn't come with strings or spreadsheets. When her uncle rose up and tore into me in front of 200 people, calling me broke and unworthy, the old wounds burned fresh, but I chose not to strike back. I chose dignity over dominance, grace over proving a point, because I finally understood that true security isn't measured in dollars or degrees. It's knowing you're enough, exactly as you are, even when the world says you're not. Sophia's love, the kind that saw me long before it ever saw my success, reminded me that sometimes the bravest thing we do is choose someone when everyone else believes there's nothing left to choose. Prejudice can shout until the rafters shake, success can stay silent in the shadows, but character, that quiet, unbreakable force inside us, is what makes an entire room rise and finally see the truth. It changed us forever, turned judgment into understanding, and showed me that love isn't about knowing every secret. It's about believing in the heart you can't see. If this story stirred something in your soul, if it reminded you of a time you were misjudged or loved someone anyway, drop a comment below and tell me what lesson hit you the hardest. I read every single one. And if you're hungry for more stories that wrap around your heart and won't let go, hit that subscribe button right now, turn on the notifications, and let's keep walking through these moments together. Your support means the world.